Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, September 24th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the 2024 presidential election, based on polling data across a number of battleground states that help paint a picture of what the current data points are telling us about this year's presidential election. The 2024 race has been one that has been really marked by a variety of different changes, a bunch of different whiplash moments in the presidential campaign that really have spun it in both the rightward direction and the leftward direction, and have made this election arguably very hard to predict. And so in an effort to really understand what the polls are saying, I wanted us to visualize what the polling averages were saying according to the 538 average, what ends up being one of the more accurate forecasters, and generally speaking, more accurate averagers when it comes down to aggregating data points from a variety of different sources, weighting them differently, engaging with them differently, and providing us a general understanding of battleground states and, of course, the national landscape between Vice President Harris and former President Donald Trump. Now, the map here that we are working with actually does really boil down to 7 key and crucial battleground states: Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. But in an effort to take a look at a lot of the data points that we've been working with, what we're going to do is expand that map. We're going to spend time right now characterizing the states where we really don't see much consideration around, and honestly, any of the polls that are out of these states really come down to being outliers. For instance, back when it was Biden versus Trump, there were some polls that ranged the state of New York from being a Biden plus 20 state to a Biden plus 9 state, and it really wasn't beneficial for us to really be engaging with polls of those states, because at the end of the day, they are going to vote how they're going to vote. And the overall shifts that we've been seeing in polls that aren't necessarily the most high quality, or in some cases are very much outliers, it doesn't really help us understand the actual national landscape, especially when some of these states have been polled maybe just once or twice, compared to maybe 20, 30, 40 times for some of these battleground states, even in the past month or 2 months. And so what I'm doing right now, again, are characterizing all the states that we really aren't going to spend too much time focusing on or worried about. Some of the states that I'm going to intentionally leave out just have some interesting data points that I want us to really engage with for just a few moments. Doesn't need to be the main focus of this video whatsoever, but generally speaking, the states that are otherwise very solid and safe for the Republican Party and Democratic Party, for instance, states like Utah and Wyoming, we aren't going to spend much time characterizing them as such. And so we're just going to look at these states really in particular. We aren't too focused on some of the ones that you might be shocked to see haven't been characterized yet, but I very much do want to engage very much in these specific battleground states at a much higher level. But again, focused on some of these states that we haven't characterized yet. So overall, Donald Trump at 118 electoral votes of states I am willing to characterize right now. Kamala Harris at about 181 electoral votes, which means, 122 for Donald Trump, which brings us roughly to where we start off with when it comes down to the safe states for the Democrats and the safe states for the Republicans. And so with 235 toss-up electoral votes, again, we are focusing on some very populous states and some very small ones. But one thing shouldn't be lost in all of this. Most of these states genuinely are competitive, meaning they will likely to be decided by anywhere less than 15 points, and in some cases, for a substantial portion of these states, by less than 5 points across these battlegrounds. And so the polls right now really do show massive fluctuations across the United States. Some regions show Donald Trump doing better than in 2020, some regions show him doing worse than in 2020, and so it really is just a very interesting dynamic when looking at the polls and looking at the data points that we've been really diving deep into for the past 2 years pertaining to this election. And so I really just want to see where we are, all right, about a month and a half out from the election, less than that. I think we're roughly 40 days to go until November. Really interesting place to be, really interesting place to watch the data unfold. So let's start off with some of the states that I'm a bit more solid on, that I have a general understanding of how they're going to go. States like Ohio, for instance, that might have some data that is sure interesting, but ultimately gives us a general understanding of where the state currently is. Ohio right now has Donald Trump ahead by roughly 10 points. That translates to an improvement off of 2020 and a likely victory for Donald Trump in that state. When we look at some other states too, states like Iowa, which typically does vote alongside that of the state of Ohio, the only real poll we've seen released recently is the Seltzer & Company poll from Ann Seltzer, the Des Moines Register. They have had one of the best polls we have ever seen in the state of Iowa and arguably across any battleground state in the nation. They say Donald Trump wins that state by roughly 4 points. And so I'm focusing really on the states that the Kamala Harris campaign isn't really honing in on, and I think there's a reason for that. These states don't really seem to be too winnable for the Democratic Party. Obviously, a 4-point lead is something that Democrats were pretty happy to see, but it's not at all what they expected, especially since the data points back in June suggested that Joe Biden was down 18 points in the same poll amongst the same group of people in the state of Iowa. And so the state of Texas actually has Donald Trump ahead by 6.4%, a minor improvement off the 2020 election, but certainly not anything to say the Texas is solidly red. This is a 6.4% win at best for Donald Trump right now. We've actually seen some recent polls showing some tightening in the state. That's not good news for the Republican Party. This is a populist state. If anything, it should be a state that Republicans consistently lock down. It has been far from that over recent election years. And so Texas, Ohio, Iowa, already likely red states, they bump up past the Democrats at 185 to the Democrats 181. To counteract that, I think we're going to start talking about states like Colorado, where we've seen the average here for Kamala Harris pretty substantive. Morning Consult had her up 15, then it had her up by 10. I say that likely characterization is very fitting and very reasonable, given where it was back in the 2020 election. In New Mexico, similar deal. Kamala Harris is ahead by roughly 8 points. She won this state by roughly 10. It actually makes a bit of sense, too, that the southwestern region of the United States might also see some bleeding, especially amongst Latino voters in states like Colorado and New Mexico, especially pertaining to the issue of immigration and the southern border crisis. There's a lot of conversation points here that Republicans have started to do a bit better on compared to Democrats, compared to 2020 and 2016, and issues like immigration are at the forefront of many of the minds of the voters that do live on the southern border, and specifically amongst white voters and Latino voters in these regions. You do start to see a little bit of bleeding from the Democratic Party, which can explain why Colorado's narrowed down a bit from 2020, and so has the state of New Mexico. And so based on the polls alone, at least, Kamala Harris wins those states by a likely Democratic margin. And when taking a look, too, at some other states where Donald Trump might do well, and you have to look at states like Florida, where Donald Trump maintains a 4.6% advantage. Now, it's not as large as Republicans would have hoped, and I think that makes sense. Florida is a state that, while was truly strong for Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio, it was the unique circumstances of those elections that really drove Republicans to do quite well. I don't think Donald Trump's going to win Florida by 20 points. I don't even think he's going to win it by double digits. I think this 4.6% margin here is quite accurate and does show that Donald Trump holds some strength in the battleground state that is substantive and improvement off of 2020, but isn't anything near what Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio were able to do, and that's because they had unique levels of appeal and popularity that Donald Trump, quite frankly, just does not share. As we move over to the state of Alaska, is one that we haven't characterized yet. There aren't many polls out. In fact, we've only seen really two since Kamala Harris has come into fray. Signal, and this is a poll sponsored by the Republican Party, shows Donald Trump up by 10, which means he's probably up by less. That's also the margin he won by in Alaska in 2020. And so anything less than 10 points is an improvement off of the 2020 election for Democrats and Kamala Harris. The most recent one from Alaska Survey Research, which is historically one of the most accurate pollsters in the state of Alaska. Donald Trump is ahead by 5 points. The average here is that Alaska is a likely Republican state. And so that brings us to 124 electoral votes. I want us to really hone in on these real battlegrounds and not waste too much time talking about the ones that are a bit on the outskirts here. But states like Maine, for instance, right, in that second district, Pan Atlantic Research shows Trump ahead by 7. Overall across the state, though, Harris is up by 9. Right across Maine's second district, though, University of New Hampshire says Kamala Harris leads by 5. In Maine's first, leads by 28 to 29. In the general election, leads the state by 17. On average here, Trump does take the lead in that second district narrowly, but what it means is that the first district is safe and that Maine at large is also a likely Democratic state, bringing Kamala Harris to 198 electoral votes. Now, the next one is the state of Minnesota. This is Tim Walz's home state. Kamala Harris maintains an advantage of 5.8%. This is actually a reduction from 2020, which is quite interesting. Joe Biden won the state by 7.1%. Granted, Minnesota does typically poll a bit closer for Democrats than what it actually is, but at the same time, we have seen a bit of a reduction in support for Kamala Harris over the past month and a half. Now it's 5.8%. Could just be a wrong set of polls, but still a likely Democratic state. But again, some reduction in support based on the 2020 election. So Kamala Harris at 208, Donald Trump at 219. Let's take a look at a state like Virginia, which doesn't typically get discussed too heavily as a battleground state, especially recently. Kamala Harris holds roughly a 6.6% advantage, about a 4-point drop from that of the last election. And the state of New Hampshire is another state, too, that we want to get through fast. 6.7% average, another drop from the last election. Kamala Harris wins that state by a likely margin. And then Nebraska second, which sees a pretty good amount of polls, actually, if you're looking at just the second district here, shows Kamala Harris up by 5, Kamala Harris up by 8 in the second district there. Trump and Biden were even, so average here is a likely Democratic victory, again, roughly on par with that of the 2020 election. And so we've really come down to these 7 battlegrounds again. To repeat them, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, that's the blue wall. North Carolina, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada, that's the Sun Belt region the Democrats try to win. And as you can see, that leading into this forecast model, leading into this prediction map based on the polls, we are really honing it in on these battleground states and what the polls are telling us in them. They are so important. Both parties have equal chances of winning at this point, arguably. 219 to 226, not much of a difference at all. And should Republicans win some states the Democrats are fighting for. They likely win the election. Same thing for Democrats here. Every single state of the 7 here are going to matter, and the direction they shift in and go in is something that I think Democrats and Republicans are going to look to on election night as an indicator of overall electoral performance and overall electoral strength. Right now, I would say Democrats have the narrow upper hand, but it very much is anybody's race at this point. And so we'll start off with the states that were the larger of margins back in the last election. States like Michigan was actually the largest margin out of any of these states that are considered to be battleground. And so we're going to move over to there first. The state of Michigan has Kamala Harris up by 2.3%, which is actually narrower again than the 2020 election. So it brings her to 241 electoral votes to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance's 219. Now, the next state to vote by a large margin is the state of North Carolina. While Michigan might have shifted towards the Republicans, North Carolina shifted towards the Democrats here, a 0.6% advantage, a very, very narrow victory, but 16 electoral votes that Donald Trump and his campaign wins nonetheless. And so again, you start to see this tightening and this narrowing across these battleground states. Next, I would look at a state like Pennsylvania, which was the next margin of victory and the next largest. That's a state that right now Democrats and Republicans have really been getting neck and neck on, but Kamala Harris holds a 1.3% advantage, which would be a narrow improvement of the 2020 election, but at large, it isn't enough. It is not enough to bring her to 270 electoral votes. Now, I actually skipped over Nevada, which is quite surprising. I typically don't do that, but Nevada was a state that was decided by 2.4%. Kamala Harris holds the narrowest of advantages in that battleground state. It is a state that historically has been quite good, arguably, for the Republican Party, or rather the Democratic Party, but Republicans have always gotten close. This election seems to be one of those where Republicans are getting very close, but Democrats ultimately pull away. And so 266, where are we at? Meaning if Wisconsin goes blue or Georgia goes blue or Arizona goes blue, Democrats win the election. But Republicans still hold the upper hand in some of these states. For instance, in Georgia, Donald Trump holds an advantage across the state of 1.5%. That's about a 2-point shift off of the last election. Really good, honestly, for Donald Trump. The state of Arizona, same thing. Donald Trump holds an advantage of 1.2%. That's about a 1.5-point shift towards the Republican Party, which means this electoral map, again, is shifting left and right. All of a sudden, you're seeing Pennsylvania shift towards the left, but Michigan shifting towards the right. All of a sudden, you're seeing some other battleground states like North Carolina shift towards the left, but Arizona shift towards the right. A lot of these things just really don't make sense. But on the general trend line here, Donald Trump narrowly improves off his 2020 margin. But the question is, now that we're coming down to the state of Wisconsin, is that shift enough? Wisconsin is a state that Kamala Harris won with Joe Biden back in 2020, with Joe Biden at the top of the ticket by 0.6%. Let's take a look at what the polls have to say about this battleground state and who might be leading the next 4 years in the administration in the White House. Wisconsin, with its 10 electoral votes, Kamala Harris holds a 1.8% advantage. What does that mean? She wins the presidency. Now, this election, as you can see, is very, very narrow. It would be one of the closest we have seen in quite some time. The last one being as close, the 2000 presidential election, and then before then, decades. And so this election cycle, I think, has very much been a very close and competitive race at almost every single step. Democrats have been trying to catch up to Republicans when it was Biden. Now, Republicans and Democrats are neck and neck, and it will continue to be neck and neck over the next month and a half. This election cycle has been, again, marked by so much uncertainty and so many changes that have genuinely altered the way we perceive this race, the way the American public votes and understands this election. This race 2 months ago had a different candidate on the Democratic ticket. Now, Kamala Harris is here. She's winning in some battleground states, but losing in others. Donald Trump is winning in some battleground states, but losing in others. And the fact remains, despite how close the last presidential election was, Donald Trump is gaining support in some states that he lost in the last race, yet still losing the presidential map. Why? Because Joe Biden built enough room for Democrats to fall quite significantly, might I add, losing Georgia, losing Arizona, but winning in some battleground states. The blue wall in specific, where now we are seeing announced Kamala Harris's campaign is set to spend $140 million more in the state of Pennsylvania between now and Election Day. That they're set to spend $70 million across Wisconsin, another $70 million across Michigan. These states are being invested in quite heavily. Nevada has tens of millions allocated to that state as well. Across the country, we are seeing in these 7 battleground states, the Kamala Harris campaign did not come here to play. And so when it comes down to where they're investing in and where they're putting Kamala Harris and Tim Walz on the ground and surrogates and campaigners and whatever it might be, it very clearly seems to be working across the blue wall. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and Nevada. Enough so that it brings her the Electoral College victory based on the current status of what polls are saying in these states. Donald Trump has a bit of a silver lining. Sure, he flips back Georgia. Sure, he flips back Arizona. But at large, what the polls tell us today, Kamala Harris wins the presidency, 276 electoral votes to former President Trump's 262. an exceptionally close race that will likely be remembered for decades to come, polling data that really swung back and forth and left to right in just few periods of time, where you see the debate had a tremendous impact, and the VP announcement had an impact, and the failed assassination attempt might have had an impact, and that so many different factors might or may have had an impact on this election. But all in all, it's a race that is still exceptionally close, and the polls and everybody else absolutely knows it. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below, subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.